20 professional caregivers had walked through the mahogany doors of the Buckhead mansion over the past 6 months. 20 had left within weeks, some in tears after particularly violent episodes, others in quiet defeat when they realized their textbook training meant nothing against the daily chaos of advanced Alzheimer's. The insurance company had just delivered their final ultimatum through a terse phone call that morning. 72 hours to show measurable progress with his father's care, or the $12,000 a month in home nursing would be cut entirely. For 19-year-old tech billionaire Marcus Chen, who'd inherited both a medical device empire worth $800 million and an Alzheimer's-stricken father at the worst possible time, this Friday deadline felt like watching his family dissolve in real time while board meetings and quarterly reports demanded his attention. The 21st candidate sitting across from his mahogany desk in the study wasn't even a nurse. Keisha Williams had cleaned houses throughout Atlanta's affluent neighborhoods for 15 years, her hands bearing the permanent evidence of bleach and scrubbing. She'd raised 3 kids in a Decatur duplex, cared for her own aging mother until last spring when diabetes finally claimed her, and somehow managed to keep her Lenox Square retail job until the pandemic shuttered half the mall stores. What she didn't have was a nursing degree, medical training, or any of the certifications that the previous 20 caregivers had prominently displayed in leather portfolios during their interviews. What she did have, sitting in that study with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and medical journals, was a question that stopped Marcus cold. What kind of music did your daddy love when he was young? The question caught him completely off guard because none of the others had asked anything remotely like it during their professional presentations. They'd inquired about salary schedules, medical protocols, emergency procedures, liability insurance. They'd wanted to know about his father's medication regimen, his aggressive episodes that had sent 2 caregivers to the emergency room, his stubborn refusal to eat that had cost him 15 pounds in 3 months. But music? Marcus found himself staring across the room at the dusty vinyl collection in the corner of his father's study. Records that hadn't been touched since his mother died 2 years ago in a car accident on I-285. Jazz, he said slowly, the word feeling strange after months of medical terminology. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker. He played trumpet in high school, even talked about going professional before the war. Keisha nodded, like this information mattered as much as his medical history, her pen moving across a worn notebook instead of an official application form. "And what about dishes?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who knew the question sounded strange. "I know that sounds odd, but does he have particular plates or bowls he likes to eat from?" Marcus blinked, his mind struggling to shift from corporate efficiency to this woman's peculiar focus on domestic details. In 6 months of detailed care instructions, medication schedules, and behavioral management plans written by professionals with impressive credentials, not one had asked about dishes. Yet here was this woman in her Target dress and worn flats, taking notes about ceramic plates like they were as important as blood pressure readings. "He won't eat from anything else," Marcus admitted, feeling foolish for never mentioning this detail to previous candidates. "We have to wash the same 4 blue plates constantly because he refuses everything else, throws food on the floor if we try to use white dishes or paper plates." Something in Keisha's expression shifted, a recognition Marcus couldn't quite read, but that reminded him of mechanics who hear familiar engine troubles. She wasn't writing down medical terminology or asking about liability insurance. She was asking about the man his father used to be, before Alzheimer's turned him into a collection of symptoms to be managed. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The weekend that followed broke every rule Marcus had established for his father's care over 6 exhausting months. Instead of following the detailed routine charts left by previous nurses, each one laminated and color-coded for different times of day, Keisha spent her first 2 days simply watching. She observed which direction Robert Chen faced when he became agitated during the evening news. She noticed that his confusion worsened when the afternoon light hit the living room windows at a particular angle, casting shadows that seemed to trigger memories of places he couldn't name. She saw him flinch every time a siren passed on Peachtree Street, though none of the thick medical reports had documented this pattern that happened dozens of times each day. Marcus found himself watching her work with the fascination of an engineer studying an unfamiliar machine. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, adjusting blinds to control the light, noting which rooms Robert gravitated toward at different times, observing how his mood changed with the rhythm of traffic outside. She didn't try to redirect his confused wandering or correct his jumbled memories about decades-old business meetings. Instead, she seemed to be mapping the geography of his remaining mind. Most remarkably, she reorganized his blue plates not by size, as every previous caregiver had done according to standard kitchen efficiency, but by shade from deepest cobalt to palest sky blue. The change seemed insignificant, almost arbitrary. When Robert ate his first complete meal in 3 weeks, that Saturday evening, Marcus couldn't explain why changing the plate order mattered. He only knew that his father had cleaned his bowl of mac and cheese, asked for seconds, and even complimented the cornbread in a voice Marcus hadn't heard, used polite conversation in months. "How did you know to do that?" Marcus asked that Sunday evening, finding Keisha in the kitchen drying those blue plates with the careful attention most people reserved for fine china. The evening light through the window caught the exhaustion around her eyes, but her movements remained patient and methodical. "I didn't know," she said simply, setting the darkest blue plate on top of the stack. "I just noticed he kept reaching for that one first, even when it was dirty. Sometimes people have reasons we can't see right away, but that doesn't mean the reasons aren't there." Marcus had spent his teenage years building algorithms that could predict market behavior with 90% accuracy, designing medical devices that saved lives in hospitals across 3 continents, managing supply chains that delivered life-saving equipment to rural communities worldwide. The idea that his father's seemingly random behaviors might follow patterns he'd missed felt like discovering he couldn't read his own native language. It challenged everything he thought he knew about problem-solving and systematic analysis. Monday morning brought the first real breakthrough, announced by the unfamiliar sound of his father's voice drifting from the dining room. Not the confused muttering or aggressive outbursts that had become the soundtrack of their mornings, but actual conversation with the rhythmic back and forth of 2 people sharing ideas. Marcus paused at his laptop, where quarterly projections had been demanding his attention since dawn, and listened to something he'd almost forgotten existed in this house. His father, talking like the man he used to be. He found Robert sitting at the dining room table with Keisha, both of them humming along to an old Miles Davis album that Marcus hadn't heard played in the house since his mother's funeral. The record player, dusty from months of neglect, filled the room with the kind of music that had provided the soundtrack to Marcus's childhood Sunday mornings. His father's fingers moved slightly on the tablecloth, following bass lines he'd memorized 50 years ago. "That's kind of blue," his father was saying with more clarity than Marcus had heard in months, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew his subject completely. Recorded in 1959, but most people don't know it was largely improvised. I had the original pressing, but Martha loved it so much she wore the grooves thin, playing it every Sunday morning. Martha, his mother's name, spoken aloud for the first time since the funeral. Robert hadn't been able to remember it when doctors asked during evaluations, couldn't place her face in photographs, grew agitated when well-meaning visitors mentioned her. Yet here he was, telling Keisha detailed stories about how his wife used to dance to this particular album while cooking Sunday dinners, how she'd insist on playing it during thunderstorms because the music made their house feel safe even when the power went out. Marcus stood in the doorway, afraid to move and break whatever delicate spell had brought his father back from the confused place where he'd been living for months. The morning light caught the silver in Robert's hair, and for a moment Marcus could see the man who had built a medical device company from nothing, who had taught him to play chess and drive stick shift and negotiate with suppliers who thought they could intimidate a teenager with inherited wealth. Keisha caught his eye and gave the slightest nod, as if to say, "This is why I asked about music." Her notebook lay open beside her coffee cup, filled with observations written in neat handwriting that looked more like field research than caregiving notes. The progress wasn't miraculous or sudden, nothing like the dramatic recoveries Marcus had hoped for during the first desperate months of his father's diagnosis. Robert still had episodes of confusion that could last hours, still became agitated when his routine was disrupted by unexpected visitors or changes in weather. But for the first time since the diagnosis, there were windows of lucidity that stretched beyond a few scattered minutes. He began sleeping through the night more often, no longer pacing the halls with the restless energy that had exhausted previous caregivers, and filled the house with the sound of footsteps at 2 in the morning. Marcus found himself studying Keisha's methods with the intensity he'd once brought to understanding complex algorithms. She never raised her voice during Robert's difficult moments, never tried to force him back to reality when he became lost in memories of Vietnam, or worried about getting to work at a job he'd retired from decades ago. Instead, she entered his world carefully, like someone walking into a stream without disturbing the water. She confirmed details from his confused timeline instead of correcting them, asked questions that helped him feel competent instead of highlighting his limitations. "Your daddy wasn't always sick," she explained one afternoon, when Marcus pressed her for techniques he could document and potentially replicate. They were standing in the kitchen while Robert napped in his chair, and she was preparing his afternoon snack with the same careful attention she gave everything else. He was a soldier, a husband, a father, a businessman. Those people are still in there, just harder to reach. I'm trying to find which one wants to come out today. It was a Tuesday when Marcus's Aunt Catherine arrived unannounced, her silver Lexus crunching up the circular driveway with the authority of someone who'd made family decisions for decades. Catherine had been vocal about her belief that Robert belonged in a memory care facility from the moment of his diagnosis, somewhere with professional medical supervision, security cameras, and the kind of structured environment that dealt efficiently with the unpredictable behaviors that came with advanced dementia. She'd never approved of Marcus trying to juggle both a billion-dollar company and his father's increasingly complex care needs, and she'd certainly never expected him to trust either responsibility to a housekeeper without medical training or professional certifications. "This has gone on long enough," Catherine announced, settling into the living room with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult family decisions. Her designer handbag sat precisely on the coffee table, and her expression carried the determined look of someone who'd driven across Atlanta during rush-hour traffic to end a situation she considered dangerous. "Robert needs professional care, not whatever experiment you're running here with unqualified help." Marcus tried to explain about the blue plates, the music therapy that seemed to unlock preserved memories, the documented improvements in Robert's sleep patterns and appetite that were visible to anyone who spent time observing. But Catherine wasn't interested in anecdotal evidence or stories about jazz albums and ceramic dishes. She wanted to know about medical protocols, board certifications, liability coverage. She wanted proof that could be presented to insurance companies and doctors, not heartwarming tales about domestic arrangements that made no sense from a medical perspective. "I've already spoken to Northside Hospital," Catherine continued, her voice carrying the finality of someone who'd made phone calls and researched options. "They have a bed available in their memory care unit next week. It's time to make the hard decision, Marcus. Your father deserves professional treatment, not well-meaning, but dangerous amateur hour." The accusation hit harder than Marcus expected, because part of him had been thinking the same thing during Robert's worst moments. When his father didn't recognize him for 3 straight days, when agitation turned to physical aggression, when the simple act of eating breakfast became a 2-hour negotiation that left everyone exhausted, Marcus wondered if he was being selfish, trying to keep his father at home. Maybe professional care, with its medications and structured environment, really was the loving choice. That evening, Marcus found a composition notebook tucked between the kitchen counter and the coffee maker, its pages worn from constant use. Keisha's handwriting filled page after page with observations that read like a behavioral scientist's field notes rather than casual caregiving records. Tuesday 2:15 p.m. becomes agitated when garbage truck arrives, settles when moved away from street-facing window. Wednesday 8:30 a.m. ate full breakfast after listening to Coltrane, refused food when radio played contemporary music. Thursday evening, asked about Martha 3 times during rainstorm, calmer when I confirmed she was at the store rather than correcting the memory. Each entry was time-stamped, cross-referenced with weather conditions, meal times, visitor arrivals, and medication schedules. This wasn't intuition or lucky guesses based on domestic experience. This was systematic observation applied with scientific precision to the seemingly random chaos of Alzheimer's care. The notebook contained 2 months of detailed behavioral data, pattern recognition that had escaped 20 trained professionals with impressive credentials and years of formal education. Marcus stayed up that night reading through observations that revealed patterns he'd never noticed despite living in the same house. Keisha had identified that Robert's aggressive episodes weren't random outbursts triggered by the disease, but responses to specific environmental stimuli that could be predicted and avoided. Sirens reminded him of wartime trauma that his medical records had never mentioned. Bright afternoon light triggered confusion because it reminded him of hospital rooms where he'd undergone frightening procedures. Unfamiliar voices in the house made him defensive because he couldn't place them in his shrinking mental map of safe people and spaces. More importantly, she documented what calmed him with the same methodical precision. The texture of his old leather chair, worn smooth by decades of evening reading. The smell of coffee brewing in the early morning, a ritual that connected him to routines from healthier years. The sound of familiar footsteps on hardwood floors, predictable rhythms that told him he was safe in his own home. Songs from his youth that bypassed damaged neural pathways and connected directly to preserved emotional memories that still responded to love and beauty. If this moment hit you, tap like. It helps more people find these stories. Wednesday brought Marcus face-to-face with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the neurologist who would conduct Friday's critical evaluation. Dr. Hendricks had overseen Robert's care since his diagnosis 18 months ago, had personally recommended most of the previous caregivers, and had been increasingly vocal about the need for institutional care as his condition worsened beyond what any family could reasonably manage at home. "I understand you've made some unconventional choices," Dr. Hendricks said, reviewing Robert's thick medical file in Marcus's study while traffic hummed steadily along Peachtree Street outside. Her expression carried the professional skepticism that comes from years of watching families exhaust themselves trying to care for loved ones whose needs had grown beyond amateur capabilities. But Alzheimer's isn't something you can manage with good intentions and home remedies. Your father needs medical supervision, structured therapy programs, professional intervention from people trained to handle the challenges his condition presents. Marcus found himself defending methods he was only beginning to understand, showing Dr. Hendricks the notebook, the documented improvements, the evidence that Robert was eating better and sleeping more consistently than he had during months of professional care. But he could see the polite doubt in her expression, the kind of professional caution that protects doctors from liability and families from false hope. She'd seen too many families convince themselves that love could substitute for medical expertise. "I'll conduct my evaluation Friday morning as scheduled," Dr. Hendricks concluded, closing the file with the finality of someone who'd already reached preliminary conclusions. But I want you to prepare for the possibility that home care is no longer viable for your father's safety or your own well-being. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is admit when we're in over our heads. That night, Marcus woke to shouting from his father's room, the kind of confused anger that had driven two previous caregivers to quit without notice. He found Robert in the hallway at 3 a.m, fully dressed in a business suit and carrying a packed leather briefcase, convinced he was late for a board meeting that existed only in his confused memory. This was exactly the kind of middle-of-the-night crisis that required physical restraint or emergency medication, according to every professional manual Marcus had studied. Keisha appeared in her bathrobe, moving with calm purpose toward the agitated man, who was checking his watch and muttering about disappointing important clients. But instead of trying to redirect him to reality or convince him the meeting wasn't real, she approached the situation like she was stepping into an ongoing conversation that made perfect sense. "Mr. Chen," she said gently, her voice carrying the tone of a competent assistant addressing her boss, "I know you don't want to be late for the presentation, but your driver called to say the car broke down on the way here. He's arranging alternative transportation, but it'll be about an hour." Robert paused, processing this information that fit seamlessly into his confused reality without challenging the logic that made sense to his damaged brain. "The Mercedes broke down?" he asked, and Marcus could hear genuine concern mixed with the confusion. "That's right, sir. Should be fixed by tomorrow afternoon, but tonight we'll need to reschedule. Why don't you get a few hours of rest before the morning meetings? You'll want to be sharp for the quarterly presentation." Marcus watched his father's agitation drain away like water from a broken dam as Keisha guided him back to his room, helping him out of his business suit and into pajamas, while maintaining the fiction that preserved his dignity and made sense of his confusion. Within 20 minutes, Robert was sleeping peacefully, the crisis resolved without medication, restraint, or the kind of forced reality orientation that typically escalated his episodes into hours of distress. "How did you know to do that?" Marcus whispered as they stood in the darkened hallway, both of them exhausted but grateful for the return of quiet. 20 years of customer service at the mall," Keisha replied, with a tired smile that contained more wisdom about human nature than most psychology textbooks. "Sometimes you have to meet people where they are instead of trying to drag them where you think they should be." The insight hit Marcus like cold water. Every caregiver, every doctor, every well-meaning family member had been trying to pull his father back to reality, to force him to acknowledge his condition and accept limitations. But Keisha had found a way to work within his confusion, to make his altered reality functional instead of fighting it every step of the way. Thursday afternoon arrived with the weight of everything that had led to this moment, pressing down on the house like Atlanta's humid summer air. Dr. Hendricks would conduct her evaluation the next morning. The insurance company was waiting for her recommendation. Catherine had made it clear that she would pursue legal guardianship if Marcus continued what she called his reckless experiment, with unqualified care that put Robert's safety at risk. Marcus spent the day watching Keisha work, trying to understand the method behind what others dismissed as instinct or luck. He saw her adjust the living room blinds throughout the day to eliminate the afternoon glare that confused Robert's spatial orientation. He watched her time his meals to coincide with the jazz playlist that kept him anchored to memories of competence and love. He noticed how she positioned herself during conversations, always to Robert's left, because his hearing was better on that side, something none of the comprehensive medical evaluations had identified, despite thousands of dollars in testing. But understanding her methods and being able to replicate them proved to be entirely different skills. When Robert became agitated during dinner, triggered by a news report about overseas military conflicts, Marcus tried to apply what he'd learned. He put on Miles Davis, adjusted the lighting to the warm yellow tone that seemed to calm his father, spoke in the gentle tone he'd heard Keisha use during difficult moments. Robert only became more confused and distressed, calling for his wife with increasing desperation that broke Marcus's heart. Keisha took over without making Marcus feel incompetent, moving through her routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs that preceded emotional storms. But she did something Marcus had never seen before, something that went beyond all the techniques he'd been trying to document and understand. From her purse, she pulled out an old cassette player, the kind that had been obsolete for decades, and a tape labeled in faded ink with his mother's careful handwriting. When she pressed play, Martha Chen's voice filled the dining room with the warm authority of someone calling her family to dinner. "Bobby, dinner's ready. Come wash up and help me set the table." It was a recording from a family gathering years ago, probably Thanksgiving or Christmas, when Martha was calling Robert in from the backyard, where he'd been grilling burgers and telling stories to visiting relatives. The voice was completely ordinary in its domesticity, preserved by accident rather than intention, but its effect on Robert was immediate and profound. His confusion dissolved like sugar in warm water. His agitation melted away completely. He looked around the room with the clarity of someone who had just remembered not only where he was, but who he was. "Martha," he said softly, not with the confused repetition that usually accompanied her name, but with recognition and love, and the kind of present-moment awareness that had been missing from his life for months. Marcus felt something break open in his chest, a mixture of grief and hope that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The recording was his mother's voice, preserved in a way that bypassed all the medical complexity of Alzheimer's and reached directly into whatever part of his father remained unchanged by disease. Keisha had somehow captured not just the sound, but the feeling of safety and love that Martha's presence had always represented in their family. "Where did you get that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely steady enough to form the words. "I asked Mrs. Rodriguez if she had any old family videos or recordings stored anywhere," Keisha said, referring to the housekeeper who'd worked for the family for over a decade. "She found boxes of them in your mama's closet, stuff she'd recorded for family reunions and holidays. I've been going through them slowly, looking for moments that might help bring him back to himself." This wasn't intuition or lucky guessing based on domestic wisdom. This was research conducted with the thoroughness of a graduate student, applied with the gentleness of someone who understood that love could be a form of medicine more powerful than anything that came in prescription bottles. Keisha had invested hours of her own time digitizing old family recordings, searching for the voices and moments that might serve as bridges back to the man Robert used to be. Friday morning arrived grey and humid, typical Atlanta weather for early October, with the kind of thick air that made everything feel heavier and more difficult. Dr. Hendricks was due at 10, Catherine at 11, and the insurance adjuster at noon. Marcus had spent the night alternating between reviewing Keisha's detailed notes and practicing explanations for methods that still felt like magic, even when he could trace their logical foundations. Robert woke confused and agitated, perhaps sensing the importance of the day through the subtle changes in household rhythm, or reacting to the tension that Marcus couldn't completely hide, despite his efforts to maintain normal routines. He refused breakfast, couldn't remember Keisha's name despite months of daily interaction, and kept asking for Martha in the plaintive voice that always broke Marcus's heart into smaller pieces. By 9:30, with Dr. Hendricks due to arrive in 30 minutes, Marcus was seriously considering whether to call and postpone the evaluation. This was not the day to showcase improvement or argue for continued home care. This was the kind of morning that had convinced previous caregivers that Robert needed professional intervention beyond what any family could reasonably provide, no matter how much love or money they invested in the effort. Dr. Hendricks arrived punctually at 10, her professional demeanor carrying the efficiency of someone who conducted these evaluations regularly and knew exactly what outcomes to expect. She found Robert in the living room, staring out the window with the vacant expression that had become increasingly common in recent months, his mind somewhere between the present moment and memories that no longer connected to anything recognizable. When she tried to engage him in the standard cognitive assessment questions, Robert looked at her without recognition, unable to remember his own name or identify the current year. His responses were fragments of confused memories from different decades, pieces of his childhood in San Francisco mixed with bits of his military service in Vietnam and concerns about business meetings that had happened years before Marcus was born. This was Alzheimer's at its most cruel, scrambling the timeline of a life until past and present became indistinguishable from each other. Marcus saw the evaluation slipping away before it had really begun, saw his father's confusion confirming every argument Catherine had made about professional care being the only safe and responsible option. But then he noticed Keisha moving quietly around the room, not interfering with the medical assessment, but preparing something out of Dr. Hendricks's line of sight with the careful attention of someone setting up a delicate experiment. The cassette player appeared on the side table almost invisibly, positioned among the medical forms and clipboard like it belonged there. When Martha's voice filled the room again, speaking with the casual authority of a wife who'd spent 30 years managing family dinners, the change in Robert was immediate and unmistakable. His expression cleared like morning fog burning off in sunlight. His posture straightened with the dignity of someone remembering his place in the world. The man who couldn't remember his own name 5 minutes earlier began answering Dr. Hendricks's questions with a clarity that made her pen pause over her evaluation forms. "I'm Robert Chen," he said with quiet dignity, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly who he was talking to. "This is my home in Buckhead. My wife Martha and I have lived here for 23 years, raised our son Marcus here. Today is—" He paused, processing the information carefully, then looked at Keisha with the trust of someone who knew he could rely on her for accuracy without judgment. "Today is Friday, October 15th, Doctor." Hendricks looked from Robert to the cassette player to Keisha, understanding dawning in her expression as she realized she was witnessing something far more sophisticated than the amateur caregiving she'd expected to find. "Mrs. Williams, what exactly is playing on that recording?" "His wife's voice," Keisha said simply, her explanation carrying no defensiveness or apology. "From family recordings we found in the house. It helps him remember who he is when everything else gets confused. Share your take in the comments. What felt like the turning point for you? What followed was the most coherent conversation Dr. Hendricks had conducted with Robert in over a year of regular evaluations. He discussed his medical condition with honest awareness of his diagnosis and its progression. He expressed clear preferences about his care while acknowledging his limitations with the kind of insight that medical professionals use to assess capacity for decision-making. He demonstrated cognitive engagement and emotional connection that had been completely absent from previous assessments, even asking about Dr. Hendricks's family and remembering details about her daughter's college graduation from a conversation months earlier. The evaluation that was supposed to recommend immediate institutional care instead documented measurable improvement across multiple categories that mattered to insurance companies and medical professionals. Robert's nutritional status had improved from concerning weight loss to stable maintenance. His sleep patterns had stabilized from the chaotic insomnia that had characterized his worst months to consistent 7-hour nights with minimal wandering. His episodes of aggressive behavior had decreased from daily occurrences that required intervention to weekly incidents that were manageable with environmental modifications. Most significantly from a medical perspective, he showed sustained periods of lucidity and emotional connection that indicated preserved cognitive function despite the disease's progression. These weren't the brief moments of clarity that sometimes occurred randomly in Alzheimer's patients, but consistent windows of awareness that could be triggered and maintained through specific environmental and emotional cues. "This is remarkable progress, Doctor," Hendrik said, reviewing her notes with the careful attention of someone whose assumptions were being challenged by evidence. "I need to understand exactly how these improvements were achieved and whether they can be replicated consistently." Catherine arrived in the middle of this discussion, prepared to advocate for immediate placement in memory care and armed with brochures from Atlanta's most respected facilities. Instead, she found herself listening to her brother participate in a family conversation with more awareness and emotional presence than she'd witnessed since his diagnosis. When Robert recognized her by name and asked about her grandchildren with genuine interest, remembering details about their school activities that he'd heard weeks ago, her arguments for institutional care suddenly felt premature and unnecessarily harsh. "I had no idea he was doing this well," Catherine admitted privately to Marcus, while Robert and Keisha worked on a jigsaw puzzle in the next room. "The last time I saw him, he didn't recognize me at all. What changed?" The insurance adjuster's visit that afternoon felt like a formality after the morning's dramatic demonstration. The documented improvements in Robert's condition, combined with the detailed care logs Keisha had maintained, and the medical evaluation that exceeded all expectations, provided more than enough evidence to justify continued home-based care. More than that, they demonstrated that significant progress was possible with the right approach, even in cases that had been written off as hopeless by multiple medical professionals. The adjuster, a practical woman who'd seen enough family situations to recognize genuine improvement when she encountered it, spent most of her visit asking Keisha about her methods rather than questioning their validity. Her report would recommend not just continuing coverage, but potentially expanding it to include the kind of specialized training that could help other families achieve similar results. That evening, as the last of the official visitors departed and the house settled into its familiar quiet, Marcus found himself sitting in the living room with his father and Keisha. Miles Davis was playing softly from the old record player that had become central to their daily routine, and Robert was leafing through photo albums with the careful attention of someone trying to preserve memories against their gradual erosion by disease. "I want to understand what you've done here," Marcus said to Keisha, his voice carrying the determination of someone who'd witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about caregiving. Not just for him, but for other families. There are people all over Atlanta, all over the country, dealing with exactly what we've been dealing with. They deserve to know that this kind of progress is possible. Keisha looked up from the 1,000-piece landscape puzzle she was working on with Robert, a project they tackled together most evenings, with the patient persistence of people who understood that some satisfactions couldn't be rushed. "It's not magic," she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining a practical skill. "It's just paying attention to what works for each individual person instead of fighting what doesn't work and getting frustrated when standard approaches fail. But how do we teach that approach to other caregivers? How do we make sure that families know to ask about music and dishes and all the specific things that matter to each person's individual history?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and the kind of responsibility that comes with discovering something valuable. Marcus had built his fortune creating medical devices that improved care for millions of patients worldwide. But this was different, more personal, and more complex. This was about the human elements of caregiving that couldn't be manufactured or programmed, only learned through patient observation, genuine respect, and the willingness to enter each person's unique experience with humility. Over the following weeks, as Robert's routine stabilized and his improvements continued to exceed medical expectations, Marcus began developing what would become the Chen Foundation's Memory Care Training Program. Working closely with Keisha, Dr. Hendricks, and a team of researchers from Emory University's Memory Disorders Clinic, they began the careful work of documenting methods that had saved his father's quality of life and could potentially help thousands of other families facing similar challenges. The program taught caregivers to conduct what they called life archaeology, the systematic gathering of personal history, preferences, and emotional triggers that could guide truly individualized care plans. It emphasized environmental observation and modification over pharmaceutical intervention as the first line of treatment. Most importantly, it trained professionals to enter the patient's altered reality with respect, rather than constantly attempting to drag them back to a present they could no longer fully comprehend. The training challenged many assumptions that dominated professional caregiving education. Instead of focusing primarily on safety protocols and medication management, it taught caregivers to look for preserved abilities and emotional connections that could serve as foundations for meaningful interaction. Instead of viewing behavioral symptoms as problems to be eliminated, it taught them to decode the communications hidden within seemingly irrational actions. 6 months after that desperate Friday deadline, Marcus stood before the board of directors of Chen Medical Devices, presenting the quarterly report that included an unexpected line item. The memory care training program had already trained 47 caregivers across 3 Atlanta area facilities, with results that impressed even the most skeptical medical professionals. Patient satisfaction scores had increased by 32%. Family retention of home care services had improved by 60%, saving insurance companies millions in institutional placement costs. Most significantly, emergency interventions and behavioral medications had decreased substantially across all participating families. The return on investment isn't just financial, Marcus told the board, his presentation carrying the confidence of someone whose personal experience had validated the business model. We're talking about keeping families together during the most difficult period of their lives, maintaining dignity for patients who deserve respect rather than just management, and reducing both the emotional and economic costs of institutional care that could have been prevented with better training and support. Catherine, who had become one of the program's most effective advocates among Atlanta's affluent families dealing with dementia care, brought a perspective that carried weight in social circles where medical decisions were often influenced by community opinion. She'd seen firsthand how individual attention to personal history and environmental factors could extend the viability of home care far beyond what traditional medical models predicted, and she wasn't shy about sharing that experience with other families facing similar decisions. Keisha had accepted the position of Director of Personalized Care Training, a role that utilized her observational skills and patient advocacy on a scale she'd never imagined possible when she was cleaning houses and working retail jobs to support her family. She spent her days teaching registered nurses and certified caregivers to see beyond medical checklists to the human being whose life story held the keys to effective care. Every person with Alzheimer's is still the person they always were, she would tell each new training group, her words carrying the authority of someone whose methods had been validated by medical professionals and insurance companies alike. The disease doesn't erase their history or their personality, it just makes those things harder to access. Our job is to build bridges back to who they are, not to force them to be who we think they should be. The program's success attracted attention from memory care facilities throughout the Southeast, then gradually across the country as word spread through professional networks and family advocacy groups. Families began specifically requesting caregivers trained in the Chen Foundation methods, and insurance companies started covering the additional training costs after seeing consistently positive outcomes in reduced emergency interventions and delayed institutional placements. Robert's improvement plateaued at a level that allowed him to remain at home with dignity and daily moments of connection that made each day worthwhile rather than just endurable. He couldn't recover what Alzheimer's had taken from his memory or his cognitive abilities, but he'd retained far more than anyone had expected because someone had finally taken the time to pay attention to what he needed as an individual rather than what the disease demanded as a diagnosis. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, Marcus found his father and Keisha in the garden behind the Buckhead house, listening to a Braves game on the radio, while Robert attempted to remember the names of the flowers Martha had planted years ago, with characteristic attention to color and seasonal timing. He couldn't recall most of their names anymore, but he remembered that she'd chosen them specifically because they bloomed at different times throughout the growing season, ensuring the garden had color from March through October. "Azaleas," Robert said with quiet satisfaction, pointing to the bright pink bushes that dominated one corner of the garden. Martha said they reminded her of her grandmother's house in Savannah, the way they made the whole yard look like a painting every spring. Keisha nodded, making a note in the ever-present composition book that had evolved from behavioral observations to a celebration of preserved memories and small victories. Each recovered fragment of Robert's life was documented not as medical data to be analyzed, but as proof that the essential person remained present even when the disease tried its hardest to claim him completely. Marcus settled into one of the wrought-iron chairs that had been part of the garden furniture for as long as he could remember, listening to the comfortable rhythm of baseball commentary mixed with crowd noise from Turner Field. This was what 20 trained professionals with impressive credentials had failed to create through months of expensive, expert intervention. Not the elimination of Alzheimer's symptoms or the restoration of his father's former capabilities, but space for Robert Chen to remain fundamentally himself within the limitations the disease imposed. The evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of traffic on Peachtree Street, the familiar soundtrack of an Atlanta neighborhood settling into twilight. Robert's attention drifted between the baseball game and the flowers, sometimes commenting on plays he understood and sometimes asking questions about plants whose names escaped him, but whose beauty he could still appreciate fully. "The gardenias should bloom next month," Robert observed, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose knowledge ran deeper than current memory. "Martha always said they smelled like wedding bouquets, but I thought they smelled like hope." It was the kind of poetic observation that reminded Marcus that Alzheimer's didn't eliminate personality or emotional depth, just made them harder to access consistently. His father had always been prone to unexpected philosophical moments, and those glimpses of his inner life had survived even when other memories had become confused or lost entirely. The Chen Foundation's memory care training program expanded to 12 states within 2 years, training over 300 caregivers in the methods that had saved one family and proved applicable to thousands more facing similar challenges. The program's success wasn't measured only in extended home care or reduced medical interventions, though both outcomes consistently exceeded expectations and impressed insurance companies focused on cost-effective care solutions. The real measure of success lived in the stories families shared during training sessions and follow-up evaluations. The grandmother who began participating in family dinners again when caregivers learned to serve her food on the china patterns from her 1952 wedding, plates that triggered memories of competence and celebration. The Korean War veteran whose aggressive episodes stopped completely when staff discovered that certain medical uniforms triggered combat memories, but baseball caps and civilian clothes allowed him to feel safe and recognized in his own home. The retired elementary school teacher who found her voice again when caregivers brought school supplies and let her organize them by color and subject, just as she had for 37 years in her classroom before retirement. The former jazz musician who could no longer remember his own name but could still play piano when his caregivers put on recordings of songs he'd performed decades earlier, his muscle memory preserving skills that conscious thought could no longer access. Each success story reinforced the same fundamental principle that Keisha had intuitively understood from the very beginning of her work with Robert. Alzheimer's care wasn't primarily about managing symptoms or maintaining safety protocols, but about preserving the essential person within the patient. It required the kind of individual attention that couldn't be standardized or mass-produced, only learned through careful observation, genuine respect for each person's unique history, and the willingness to meet people where they were, rather than where medical textbooks said they should be. Marcus had discovered through personal experience that the most sophisticated medical technology his company produced couldn't replace the simple but profound act of paying attention to what mattered to each individual patient as a human being with decades of experiences, relationships, and preferences that remained meaningful even when memory became unreliable. The breakthrough that had saved his father's quality of life hadn't emerged from research laboratories or clinical trials funded by pharmaceutical companies, but from a housekeeper who understood intuitively that dignity and emotional connection were as important as medication schedules and safety protocols in determining whether someone could live well with a devastating diagnosis. The training program challenged medical professionals to expand their definition of successful treatment beyond the traditional metrics of symptom management and behavioral control. Instead of viewing improvement solely through the lens of cognitive testing and medication compliance, it taught caregivers to recognize and celebrate preserved abilities, meaningful connections, and moments of joy that made each day worthwhile regardless of diagnosis. Dr. Hendricks, who had initially been skeptical of unconventional approaches to dementia care, became one of the program's most respected advocates after witnessing Robert's sustained improvement and seeing similar results replicated across multiple families. She began incorporating the program's principles into her medical practice, training residents to ask about music preferences and family traditions, alongside standard neurological assessments. "We've been thinking about Alzheimer's backwards," she explained, during a presentation at the annual conference of the American Academy of Neurology. "Instead of focusing primarily on what patients have lost, we need to identify and strengthen what remains. Memory may be damaged, but personality, emotional capacity, and the need for dignity and connection survive far longer than our medical models typically acknowledge." The approach required more time and attention than standard institutional care models typically allowed, but the results justified the investment in terms of both human outcomes and economic efficiency. Families who received training in personalized care methods were able to maintain home-based care for an average of 18 months longer than those using traditional approaches, saving substantial costs in institutional placement while providing better quality of life for both patients and family members. The last recorded entry in Keisha's original composition book, written 18 months after that desperate Friday deadline that had threatened to separate Robert from his family and his home, captured the transformation that had begun with simple questions about jazz music and blue ceramic plates. Robert ate breakfast without assistance this morning, recognized Marcus by name, and asked to help with the garden. When Marcus showed him pictures from last week's family dinner, he remembered being there and commented on how good the cornbread tasted. Small victories, but they add up to a life that's still worth living. The program's influence extended beyond Atlanta's affluent neighborhoods to rural communities, urban housing projects, and suburban assisted living facilities where families struggled with limited resources and inadequate support systems. Training materials were translated into Spanish and Korean to serve Atlanta's diverse immigrant communities, where cultural barriers often complicated access to quality dementia care. Marcus established satellite training centers in Birmingham, Nashville, and Jacksonville, each one staffed by caregivers who had completed the full certification program and demonstrated success in applying its principles across different cultural and economic contexts. The expansion required substantial investment from the Chen Foundation, but the social impact justified every dollar spent on training and infrastructure. Community health centers began requesting training for their staff members who worked with elderly patients showing early signs of cognitive decline. The program's emphasis on environmental modification and personalized approaches proved particularly valuable in preventing behavioral crises that often led to unnecessary emergency room visits and premature institutional placement. 5 years after Keisha Williams first walked through the mahogany doors of the Buckhead mansion, the Chen Foundation's approach to memory care had influenced policy discussions at the state and federal level. Insurance companies began covering personalized care assessments as standard practice, recognizing that investment in individual attention typically prevented more expensive interventions later in the disease progression. Robert Chen continued to live at home with his son, surrounded by jazz music, blue ceramic plates, and the patient presence of caregivers who understood that his confused questions about Martha weren't symptoms to be corrected, but expressions of love that deserved gentle, respectful responses. His condition had stabilized rather than improved dramatically, but stability in Alzheimer's care represented a victory that exceeded most families' expectations. On quiet evenings, when Atlanta's summer humidity gave way to the cooler air of approaching autumn, Marcus would find his father and Keisha in the garden or the living room, engaged in the simple activities that had become the foundation of Robert's remaining happiness. Jigsaw puzzles that exercised preserved visual processing skills, photo albums that triggered fragments of preserved memory, radio broadcasts that connected him to the rhythms of a world beyond his immediate confusion. The transformation hadn't eliminated the challenges of caring for someone with Alzheimer's, but it had made those challenges manageable within the context of a life that retained meaning, dignity, and moments of genuine joy. Robert still had difficult days when confusion overwhelmed his capacity to engage with the present moment, but those days no longer defined his existence or determined his family's options for care. The success of the Chen Foundation's program demonstrated that even the most devastating diagnoses didn't have to eliminate hope or force families to choose between safety and love. With adequate training, support, and commitment to seeing each patient as an individual rather than a collection of symptoms, it was possible to create care environments where people could live well despite serious illness. Marcus had learned that the most important innovations in healthcare weren't always technological breakthroughs or pharmaceutical discoveries, but sometimes simply represented better ways of paying attention to human needs that had been overlooked by systems focused on efficiency rather than effectiveness in preserving what made life worth living. Drop a quick like if you're rooting for care that looks like this in real life.